This is side one of tape 4 of a series of tapes on the history of Hawarden, Iowa, that has been prepared by Proctor W. Maynard. Earlier tapes will carry some of the background from which Proctor W. Maynard is preparing these tapes, so I will not go into that any further on this tape. One of the topics that ought to be brought out in connection with my boyhood school experiences, high school experiences in particular, was participation in a football game. I was not much of a football player because I was not very big and not very athletically inclined, not very well coordinated. But one of the experiences that I consider very memorable was participating in a football game with another team, and I don't remember just which school nearby it was. I do remember that their team wasn't a particularly good team, in which Gordon Meter, Butch Meter as we all called him, scored a drop kick, which as I remember it was from the point of departure of the ball to the point where it first touched the ground outside the baseball and football field over the fence on the other side of the road, a total of 72 yards. This scoring drop kick was reported in the Chicago Tribune, and I believe that, although I have not verified this fact, it still stands as the longest scoring drop kick, at least at the high school level. I may be wrong about that, but I think that is the case even to this day. I am tempted to make comments about some of the other aspects of football, some of the dirty trick plays that were used. One high school teammate of mine chewed tobacco and was frequently accused of spitting tobacco juice in the eyes of his opponents. I think he did. On other occasions, he was accused of throwing dust and dirt in the eyes. And I have seen him do that, and he was particularly clever at it. Those things were regarded, they were penalized when they happened, but they were regarded as just part of the game. The game at the time that I was on the squad was much cleaner than it had been many years earlier. And Hawarden had a reputation for being a particularly competitive and aggressive and not very clean team as far as the way in which it played its opponents. They used the flying wedge and various other devices like that, as long as those were legal. So that Hawarden's football record was always pretty successful, or usually pretty successful, but not always one that one could look back on with a great deal of admiration today. I think I might mention that when Butch Meter kicked this scoring drop kick, all of us started to run down the field, including the officials, as was always done on any kickoff or any punt or anything of that sort. And partway down the line, we realized that this was going to be an unusual kick, and as I remember it, virtually everybody on the field just stopped and watched to see whether it would go through the bars and whether it would score or not. Nobody quite expected that it would land on the other side of the highway and be one of the longest scoring drop kicks ever scored until it was almost ready to touch the ground. Then I think we all just started to walk down there, and the game was virtually over for a time. Most of our swimming activities in the summertime occurred in the gravel pits that were always being dug between the Sioux River and the main district of Hawarden. Hawarden was located on what must have been either a very large medial glacial moraine or a terminal moraine, probably a terminal moraine, and there was a very long and very deep deposit of gravel. A number of different gravel companies mined this gravel at one time or another as Iowa began to improve its roads, and usually they had a floating barge on the gravel pit after they dug a hole, and this barge sucked up the gravel, ran it through screens, washed it, and prepared different types and different sizes of gravel. This meant that there was a large, for us anyway, a large body of water, quite cold, quite deep, and quite dangerous actually, because there was practically no beach to it. But this is where we did most of our swimming, especially on hot summer days. Usually in August it became infected with algae, and the dog days, as we called them, were upon us, and it wasn't wise to go in swimming. In fact, I got a bad inner ear infection out of swimming at that time, and for several weeks was laid up with a very bad abscess in my inner ear. But there is one aspect of that swimming hole experience that has never been straightened out the way it should. Fred King and I were neighbors, either side by side or back to back, for most of our boyhood and high school days. We were on the same debate team together. He was a year or two younger than I was, but we were together a great deal. So we used to go swimming a great deal. I never was particularly good at swimming, but I got so that I could handle myself reasonably well, and on one occasion at least did manage to rescue a youngster who had gotten frightened and gotten in over his head and was going under for the second time, I think, when I managed to get a hold of him and pull him up on the bank. But I wasn't really an exceptionally good or an exceptionally strong swimmer. Fred King, however, was a different story. He delighted in floating, swimming on his back and floating. And so we would swim back and forth in the gravel pit. Sometimes it was a longer distance, sometimes not so far. But we would swim back and forth, and before very long, Fred would roll over on his back and float, swim backward some, and just paddle with his feet. His feet had unusually flexible ankle joints, so that he could paddle with a considerable degree of efficiency just with his feet alone. We both went to the University of Iowa. I went 1 year ahead of Fred. And the University of Iowa had a requirement that by the end of your sophomore year, you had to pass a swimming test, which required that you swim 5 lengths of the pool, 2 lengths of which were to be your particular version of the Australian crawl stroke. Most of us did a rather sloppy job of it, but enough to get by. And then you could swim 3 lengths of the pool. This was an Olympic-sized swimming pool. You could swim 3 lengths freestyle, any style you wanted. Well, Fred King took the swimming test from the head swimming coach, Dave Armbruster, sometime in his freshman year, I think, although it might have been in his sophomore year. And as soon as he had swum his 2 lengths, he rolled over on his back and swam backward, just a homegrown version of the backstroke with his feet paddling, while Dave Armbruster watched him. When he got out of the pool, Armbruster asked him about what swimming pool experience he had, and Fred told him that he'd had none at all, and that he'd only gone swimming in gravel pits. And Dave Armbruster asked him if he'd had any coaching, and Fred said he hadn't. So Armbruster asked him to come out for the swimming team as backstroke. We had on the swimming team at that time a backstroke I think he was a junior or a senior, who had won the conference title the year before as a backstroke. I don't recall that it was a record, but it was good enough to win the conference title the year before. So Fred began to work diligently. Armbruster showed him how to make his turns and coached him on some of the finer points of backstroke swimming. We were rooming together, and Fred practiced these things by the hour. Armbruster got him cod liver oil to build up his weight and his physical capabilities, and within just a matter of weeks, Fred had beaten out for the first position on the Iowa swimming team, and Iowa always had good swimming teams in those days. I think still has a reputation for being above the ordinary in swimming. But at any rate, Fred beat out the more experienced man for first position on the swimming team as backstroke. He went on either that year or a year or two later to set a conference record in the backstroke. The metropolitan newspapers, Des Moines and Davenport, and even the Sioux City newspapers, never could figure out how and why this nobody from never heard of before could come in and beat out the regular backstroke, who was, if I remember correctly, from one of the Des Moines high schools in such a brief period of time. They never did get the story correct. They had him placed in all sorts of schools across the state. They never did succeed in getting the real story, which was far more intriguing and far more sensational than anything they ran. But they tried to explain him away on the basis that he had had training at Council Bluffs, or I think it was, or Waterloo, or various schools, city schools around, in order to, I suppose, save their face. That's why. The truth of the matter was that it was one of those Horatio Alger stories that would have been a lot better newspaper story for them if they'd gotten the straight of it. Why they didn't get it straight, I don't know. George Anderson was busy in the journalism department at that particular time. I think he was in Fred's class. Dave Armbruster, I think, knew the full story of just how totally uncoached and inexperienced he was. But for whatever reason, during the time that I was at the university, and for a year or two after that, never once in any story that I saw did the newspapers, the Des Moines Register, Sioux City Tribune or Journal, or any of the other papers get the really true story of how Fred had gotten his lack of training and how he was almost entirely self-taught. I think this ought to be made a matter of record somewhere, so that Fred gets full credit for what he did accomplish, largely by himself, in this athletic event. Still another of these Horatio Alger type stories to come out of Hawarden that ought to be told is that of Jack Handy and Walt Disney Studios. Jack Handy was a classmate of mine because Jack was one of those who had come along a little more slowly than some of the others and was actually a year behind his normal class. After I had graduated and left, I learned that Jack Handy had gone out to California and had gotten a job with Walt Disney Studios. That was the first that I realized, first that I remembered, that all during our class days, whenever Jack Handy and I sat in class, he was doodling. His notebook was just a collection of doodles, of drawings of one kind or another. And I remembered then that some of those drawings had shown a good deal of finesse. At the time, nobody thought very much about it, and my first reaction was as surprised as anybody else's. Jack Handy's father had the restaurant in the old Gladstone Hotel before it was torn down, and I don't know what became of Jack Handy and his father during the years before or after he graduated, before he went with Walt Disney. Just how much space when Mr. Handy passed away, all of that I do not know about, but I do remember very distinctly Jack Handy's doodling in the class, and although it didn't make much impression at the time, I realized later that this was significant. The last of the school anecdotes that I want to record concerns the action of the school board in employing John Berner as the building inspector during the construction of the new high school, which occurred perhaps about 1928 or, well, no, earlier than that, which occurred about 1924 or 1925. My father was on the school board at the time and was on the school board building committee. He told me that they had employed John Berner as the building inspector. The usual pattern in those days when a contractor was building a building like a school building was for the architect to be both the building inspector and the final judge in case of conflict between the contractor and the building inspector. The only trouble with this was that the architect just came around once every few days, or maybe not even every week, because he was busy with other jobs. And so the school board decided that if they were going to get their money's worth, they should have a building inspector on the job full time. John Berner was a building contractor, primarily a cement contractor, who had lost one eye, I've always heard, in a barroom brawl. Somebody gouged it out with a broken beer bottle, but I don't know whether that is correct or not. But at any rate, John Berner had only one eye, and the school board hired him to be building inspector, paying him more for his work than he had expected to be able to earn during that summer and fall of contracting activity on his own part. The result was that this considerably outfoxed the contractor. Contractors in those days were highly competitive and had to to cut every corner they could, and they counted on their profit coming in the way in which they were able to fudge on the specifications. John Berner knew how to read blueprints and specifications, and so the first thing we knew, work was halted while John Berner and the contractor had an argument over whether or not the contractor was complying with specifications. As I remember it, one of the arguments had to do with the number of wall ties to tie the face brick to the common brick walls on the inside, whether they were being laid as frequently as they should be or not. Berner's argument was that they were putting in half the number that were supposed to be there by the specifications. We were all laid off for a day or two until the architect got up there and settled the argument. Berner was right. Later on, when they were pouring reinforced concrete floors, the spacers for the reinforcing rods were, according to John Berner, not as called for in the specifications. There weren't as many of them, they were farther apart, and he didn't think they would be adequate when the wet cement was put in on them. Again, we were held up for a day or two waiting for the architect to come around. The architect was always the final judge in these matters. I remember there was one interior wall that was poured. It required a long, the cement mixer was at some distance away, so it required a long chute to carry the cement over to the farther end of the wall. specifications required that there be one man with a hoe every so many feet, I think it was every 8 or 10 feet, to hoe down the fine cement aggregate to come along with the coarser, faster moving, larger aggregate. If that wasn't done, there would be pockets of large stones covered with with a cement coating, but no fine stuff to hold them together. The contractor had been trying to save money by not putting as many men on this chute, using them elsewhere instead. Again, we were laid off while John Berner and the contractor argued about this. Eventually, the architect ordered the rough boards removed from the drywall, and it was found that there were a lot of pockets of this sort. The usual contractor's practice in those cases was to plaster over with a fine aggregate to cover up this so that it would look like the rest of it. But this was contrary to the specifications. So the end result was that the contractor had to tear out this whole green wall. I don't remember the length of it now, probably 20 or 30 feet long and probably 8 feet high. The whole wall had to be torn out and re-poured. And the contractor was very bitter about that. He said, I can't make any money on this job. And after that, I think, was pretty much the turning point. From that time on, the contractor held very closely to specifications, and we were no longer laid off as often as we might be. I took exams at the University of Iowa on Friday, came back home, got a job with the contractor, and went to work on Monday, totally out of condition. And I'm sure that I should have been fired and would have been fired that first week probably if my father hadn't been on the building committee. I take a little pride in the fact that by the end of the summer, the contractor, his son, said that I was one of the better workmen that he had on the job, although he had thought first week that he was going to have to fire me. I, of course, like all young fellows just starting out on that kind of a job, overdid myself, and the older workers had to calm me down and tell me not to get out of turn and various things of that sort. But did manage to stick it out, although it was pretty rough the first 2 or 3 weeks there, being as badly out of condition as I was. But anyone who looks at the intermediate, what is now the intermediate school today, looks closely for the kind of work that was done in that period, should realize that whatever quality of work is to be found in that school building, and I think it is a pretty high quality of work, they owe a great deal of debt to this local man, John Berner, because he knew the specifications and he held the contractor to them, and he won out every time on the squabbles between the contractor and himself as building inspector. I think it is time to shift the perspective again from school experiences and the like to a kind of a potpourri of other topics that ought to be brought out that I recall in connection with those days in the history of Hawarden. One of the things that I recall my father telling me about, although I was not there at the time, I may have been at college or I may have been actually teaching by that time, was when a state committee came to Hawarden to inspect Oak Grove State Park, or to Oak Grove, to see whether it should be made into a state park or not. I think that it is no longer a state park, but has been classified as a county park. I don't know the background for that change. But Oak Grove was, of course, a rather unique area, and there was a feeling of mine in the 1920s that it was distinctive enough so that it ought to be made a state park. I think my father was on the local committee that was to meet with the state park inspection group, or he may just simply have been along as one of the interested citizens. He had had some courses in botany, either at the University of South Dakota or the University of Chicago, I don't know which, and of course riding horseback on the prairie for days at a time. He'd had quite an opportunity to study the flora and the fauna of the prairie. And I would imagine that my grandfather and grandmother both had had some training along that line too, and some familiarity with it. At any rate, he was on the committee, and what struck him, and I think he played some part in advancing the idea, was that Oak Grove was a sort of a boundary line, a meeting place between the flora and fauna of the western prairies, the high plains prairies, further west in Dakota and Montana and Wyoming, and the more midwestern prairies, the black dirt prairies and the black walnut prairies and that type of prairie of middle and eastern Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, and the like. The flora and fauna of Oak Grove represented a meeting ground between these two types of ecological systems, and was a particularly good point for students and other interested people to study them. I had not, of course, realized that something like this was the case, but my father pointed out a number of plants and other instances that brought this about. I don't know whether this is on record somewhere or not, but I think it probably ought to be a part of the record as to the background of Oak Grove State Park, that there was a rather unique botanical reason for it being made into a state park at that time. We used to do some of our swimming in Dry Creek, particularly in Dry Creek east of Hawarden. Not very much west of Hawarden. We were getting too close to the sewage area there. But east of Hawarden, Dry Creek seemed to be a creek when it had enough water in it that we could feel safe to swim in, so we did quite a little swimming in there. One thing that always puzzled me, and that I asked my father about on a number of occasions, was the fact that very frequently in some of the kind of marshy areas along the bank of Dry Creek, there would be quite an oil film. My father always said, "Oh, that's just marsh gas. That's just the product of marsh gas, decay of plants and animals and so on." And that may be all that it is, or all that it was. I don't know. But I have wondered about it some, and still wonder if maybe there ought not to be some further exploration. Along with that is the fact that there was in the 1920s a report that appeared in the Independent of a farmer living somewhere out east of Hawarden, and I don't remember the name of the man or whether he lived straight east, northeast, or southeast of Hawarden, who had a vein of coal outcropping on his farm, and who heated his house from that coal, and never had to buy any. I do remember that one of the news stories, I think this was during Merle Stone's period of ownership of the paper, one of the coal companies in the Iowa coal area sent representatives up there to look over the seam and decided that it was not worthy of exploitation, that there wasn't enough coal there as I remember it, the farmer who used the coal, thought that it was pretty good coal. Iowa coal, of course, generally speaking, was a pretty smoky coal, and some would say a not very satisfactory coal. But I have wondered whether there may be some relationship between these oil films that appeared in marshy places on Dry Creek and the coal deposits. Of course, further north, further west, there are coal deposits, not only of black coal, as this was supposed to be, but also of brown coal, and we now have the tremendous coal deposit development of eastern Montana, or of Montana and Wyoming. So whether this is something that should again be explored, whether Hawarden is missing an opportunity or not, I can't say. But at least I do think it probably ought to go on record that there would be a little reason for looking into it, at least just a bit further, if nothing else out of curiosity. Two instances of folk medicine resulting in missed opportunities for real progress in the field of medicine in Hawarden occurred during my boyhood that are perhaps worthy of some comment at this time. When we lived down across the street from the Catholic school, I was, of course, a rather small boy. I remember that one of the neighbors acquired blood poisoning from some farm activities. I don't recall just the circumstances, and was given up by the doctors. They invaded the lymph glands under the arm, and he was in pretty bad shape, not expected to live. Fred King's mother, Mrs. Walter King, lived next door to us. She had been raised in St. Louis, I believe it was, and was of German background. She advised the wife of the man who was sick. As I remember it, it was Earl Sly's father-in-law, but that may not be quite correct. At any rate, she advised the wife to get moldy bread and make a poultice of moldy bread, open the abscesses under the arm, and to pack them with the moldy bread. The doctors refused to have anything to do with it, and they said they just have to let nature take its course. As I remember, the moldy bread poultice was used. The man did recover, and of course Hawarden lost its opportunity to be the discoverer of penicillin, because obviously that was what was happening with the moldy bread. I've mentioned this to several people since that time, and I find that among a good many Europeans, the idea of moldy bread poultices for infections of that sort was a long-standing, well-known practice. It is unfortunate that it took so long for Western medicine to follow up on the lead and discover penicillin. The other situation did not end as fortunately. When we lived up in the house on the hill, a neighbor not too far from us, I think the family name was Johnson. They lived in the house that was later owned by Roy Wilkinson. An oil stove exploded, and their daughter, as I remember it, a teenager, was very, very badly burned. In fact, she died a few days later, and I remember there was quite a little discussion about what percentage of her body was third-degree burns and so on, and what were the chances of survival under those circumstances. Again, some one of the neighbor ladies, and I am not sure just which one it was, suggested that they ought to boil real strong tea, boil the tea and make it real strong, soak it sheets in a tub full of boiled tea, and wrap the girl's body in it. This, of course, was not done. The Johnson girl did not survive, and again, the use of tannic acid for burns had to wait in this country, another 20 years or so, 20, 30 years perhaps, before it was widely recognized. I suppose in almost any community one could come up with various folk remedy stories that have a somewhat similar set of circumstances, missed opportunities. Western medicine has all too often been rather poor about turning to other types of remedies that have come out of the folklore tradition. One thing I might make a comment about is the effect of the changing times on Mr. Bemis, the harness maker. Mr. Bemis had a shop near where the Paramore Studios and Sumner's furniture store was located, and he was the harness maker. I don't remember whether there were any others or not, but I think he was the only harness maker during the World War I period. Of course, during World War I, when harnesses for teams of horses were in great demand, Mr. Bemis was very prosperous, did very well, and built a new house, and generally felt the benefit of the wartime demand. Of course, with the end of the war and the coming of the kerosene and gasoline tractor, the business fell off. Mr. Bemis tried several things to find a solution for the problem. He had, of course, used quite a lot of rubber cement in the handling of leather, so he tried shoe repair, did some with that. He put in a line of shoes. These were mostly work-type shoes. I think they were Buster Brown shoes, but they were not particularly stylish, and that didn't go. Because he was familiar with rubber cement, he tried to get into tire repair, but that too didn't pan out, partly because the curb in front of his place was very high and he had no direct drive entrance into his building when they had to change the tire in the street and take it in, or go around to the back door, and very few ever did go around to the back door. So hard times came to Mr. Bemis because of the change from horses and the need for harness to tractors, automobiles, all the rest of it. And there really was no satisfactory answer in his particular case. Still another aspect of the changing times and the dislocations that resulted from it occurred in the railroad yards. Beginning after the federal administration of the railroads in the 1920s, the railroads began to make rapid changes in the type of equipment they used and the length of time that locomotives could go before they needed to reach a division center and be changed over, and many such changes occurred. The result was, with the unionization of the railroad employees and the increased wages that resulted from unionization and all the rest of it that went with that, that fewer and fewer railroad employees were needed, and after the unions got a seniority system installed, more and more seniority bumping of men to when vacancies arose began to occur, so that the railroad men in Hawarden began to experience a good deal of hard times. And of course, as time went on over the years, Hawarden lost first one, then a number, finally all three of its division centers, its railroad roundhouse, and the railroad business by now has largely disappeared. The seniority bumping that we began to see even while I was still in school, and the family disorganization and difficulties that resulted from that were the beginning of the end of the railroads as we had known them prior to that time. Hawarden being a cattle feeding, the center for a cattle feeding area, many of the cattle were shipped in from the ranches and the dry plains to the west for feeding out in the fall. It would be logical that the railroad yards would provide stock loading pens and a fair-sized stockyards for a small town on both the Milwaukee Railroad and on the Northwestern Railroad. One thing that always interested me whenever it happened was that every once in a while signs would be posted on those, more often on the Northwestern than the Milwaukee, but on both sets of stock loading pens, signs would be posted that they were quarantined because of hoof and mouth disease, or they were quarantined because of hog cholera. Hog cholera medicine had come into vaccination, had come into being during the period and was being more and more widely used, but there still were a good many farmers who did not vaccinate their hogs for hog cholera. Both hoof and mouth disease and hog cholera were highly infectious, and the yards were, of course, sprayed with Lysol, scrubbed down with Lysol, whitewashed, and whatever other sanitation methods were necessary. This happened a number of times during my years of growing up in Hawarden in the 1920s. This will be the end of side 1 of tape 4 of the series of tapes on the history of Hawarden, Iowa.